Hey, the franchise, Shane Douglas. Welcome back to Appalachian Expose. The guy sitting next to me needs no introduction, right? When you talk about professional wrestling, especially for my generation coming up in the business, it was these guys that were in the dressing room running the show, teaching us what we were doing. So, first of all, Kevin, thank you for being here, brother. Appreciate it. Got him all the way over from West Coast land of the country. He sort of stays in his lair there, right? Old Scratch. But what I always tell people on these, Kev, what we do is the conversations we'd have in the car, the first trips we make, these are the same conversations that I think the fans are interested in hearing. Cool. Let us know, by the way. So let's get started at the beginning. What led Kevin Sullivan to professional wrestling?
I was always a fan of pro wrestling as a kid, and then I kind of got out of it because I started amateur wrestling.
Yeah.
But then one night I went to see wrestling in Boston Garden, and the original Sheik was on the card.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, some of the shit is real bullshit, right? And then he came out, and I thought the building actually moved.
Yeah.
He was so different, so intense. I said, well.
Were you scared of him?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, this may be bullshit, but he's real.
Yeah.
And he was the presence, you saw him. The presence was remarkable. And I got hooked in and never looked back, I guess.
No, I'm going to jump all over the place here because there's so many points I want to talk to you about. So having been the guy in the office, actually creating new characters and stuff, how relevant was it for you, a character like the original Sheik? Because I think the best in our business are the ones that can get in front of that camera and tell you they're a cowboy or a dead man or a crazy Arab from the Middle East and make you believe it.
Yeah, and the amazing thing about him was he never talked. He always had and I thought he stayed in gimmick constantly.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I sometimes thought, well, that was a detriment to him, but it wasn't because he lived in the territory they ran.
Yeah.
So he didn't expose his business, but it's the most important thing.
Yeah.
As you know, you're the franchise. You project being a franchise. Yeah. If you don't feel that you're that character, it's not going to work.
Yeah. I mean, none of us are great actors, right? No. We're not going to go out and have an Academy Award handed to us for a movie, but you put us in the ring as the devil, as the franchise, as the Sheik. By the way, everything that you just said about me as far as living that character, that's what I learned from you guys. I watched you guys doing that. Dominic, Bruno, you, on and on, all these greats that I got to work with. And you remember those old timers, like they did not, your buddies out front watching the show, if they heard you, hey buddy, man, Kevin's a really good friend. Yeah. You get your ass dragged into the shower, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, you were, because you're now digging into their livelihood.
Absolutely. I mean, when in Florida, the standing room was if you got in a fight in a bar, they would pay for the lawyer. But if you lost, you had to leave that night.
Yes, yeah.
So it was a whole different mindset. And like you said, there were guys in the business that didn't even smarten up their family.
Right.
And to me, it's like, back then, it was almost like you joined the Mafia.
Yeah.
You were part of the family, and the family came first. So the wrestling came first because if we didn't all pull together, there was going to be a wink link, and we wouldn't get paid because back then there was no contracts,
no guarantees.
Yeah, so you had to make it off the house, and you want to make sure everybody's pulling their weight, and you didn't want. I'll give you an example. Me and Mike was tag team champions, so we were supposed to lose on TV. Blackjack wasn't Mulligan. Blackjack. No, it was some Canadian blackjack and his partner. And Mike was going to get the hard weight, the first fight he ever got. Mm-hmm. And somehow Eddie found out that he told his girlfriend told somebody that Eddie knew.
Yeah.
Eddie fired the guy immediately and changed the whole program. And I mean, he had laid the program out for like 4 months. Mm-hmm. So they took that shit real serious.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the mob just now. It's like the mob. Again, the Nadia Green kid coming in. as I'm watching in those independent shows how things were done, it felt like that. And I even went to Dominic and I said, like, does this have anything to do with organized crime or something? Because it looked like that, right? You run Boston, I run Pittsburgh, and he just started laughing. How ridiculous of a question it was. But that's what it looked like to me coming in.
Well, you were smarter than you thought, because I just read a book. It's called Old School Ring Squared, and it starts in 1948 when the NWA was founded.
Yeah,
They were all founded on port cities, the big ones, right?
sure.
And up until that point, the Mafia had controlled boxing from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I never thought of that.
So the story said, it's a historical novel, but you'll figure out who the names are.
Yeah.
Supposedly, that was the same year the mob had that big meeting, and they cut up the country and the families.
Right,
It was almost like they infiltrated wrestling without the wrestlers knowing about it, but the promoters did, because they could put the guys into the athletic commission.
Right.
They could take away the athletic commission.
Yeah.
They could put somebody in the box office that isn't counting the receipts, right?
Right.
So, yeah, without us knowing it, I think we were infiltrated back in the day, and I'm sure it's not infiltrated anymore, but
Right.
back in the day, I mean, it was the Wild West, and what was crazy was, here's these guys in the NWA running their own fiefdoms, right?
Yes.
But
yeah.
some of them would cross and run against their
Oh,
own
would
members.
they?
Yeah, like they did in St. Louis. I mean,
Yeah.
Bushwick's
What's the
territory. Eddie Quinn came down from Montreal and ran St. Louis. And then, so, and then the other thing, you know him well, Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle.
Yeah.
They were NWA members, and they would run against NWA members in different areas. So it was really, really a cutthroat business. And I just found this out recently. Do you know when, Vince went on Junior? You know when Vince Jr. went on the tear where he took the country over?
Right.
That might have been a burr in his bonnet for years, because did you know Rocca ran against Vince Sr.?
I did hear that story. I can't remember the particulars, but I remember hearing that.
Jim Crockett Sr. backed him because they had a dispute where the territories ended. Because, the Northeast came all the way down to Baltimore.
Right.
And Crockett was running right around Baltimore.
Up to there, yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny that here they are, both NWA members, both on the board, and they're arguing with one another.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I wonder, my wheels are turning here, just trying to dig back into my history again. Late at post-World War II is when the government started to build the case against the Mafia, right? So they target Las Vegas and Reno. Was that the 50s or 60s that they knocked the mob out of there?
It was the 50s, and I think it got rid by the 60s. But the other thing was that happened, a lot of people don't know this, the NWA was sued by the government for monopoly.
Really? No kidding.
Monopoly, yeah.
What year was that?
That was, I think, 55 or 56.
Interesting.
When wrestling, started being hot on TV and
Yeah.
everybody was running, there was a guy named Dizzy Davis. He started a run Houston against Morris Siegel. They burnt his building down and his house down.
No kidding.
Yeah, and the
Message received.
The government stepped in and really spanked their hands. And I think there was a huge payoff somewhere, because here's this case going to go to court about monopoly. They just got the mob, and now all of a sudden everything becomes copacetic again.
Yeah.
So
they publicly they had shown that they stood up to the mob.
yeah.
Now they find something like this out and they go try to hush it.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's in those days, because I have a vague, scant memory of the territories. Not that I understood or moved territory to territory like you guys did. But I remember Portland, Memphis, Mid South, NWA, so on and so forth. There was still a good chunk of companies around that. If Bill Watts would have fired me, I might have been able to go to Portland or Memphis or whatever. Give me some of the, because I know that we always, as you hear people talk about it in this business, especially from us, it almost like aggrandizes, makes it a perfect thing at the territory. There was also a lot of bad. What were the good and bad parts of the territory system that you saw?
Well, I got in when I got in, it was a completely different. There was 37 territories around when I was got in the business, and you didn't tell a promoter that you were going to go until you got a place, right?
Right.
And back then, there was some guys were close with the promoters, and they'd say, "Well, what's he making? Okay, I got to make him that much." And then when the guy gave his notice, the promoter may not want him to leave, but he gave his notice and he left because the other guy wanted him. When it got to be when you were in there, if you want to leave Bill,
yeah,
he might call and say, "Hey, I need Shane.
Wow.
Don't let him go." And, okay, Bill, we'll make it right for you. And I'll give you an example. One time, I was in the Florida office, and Eddie was talking to Dusty, and Pez Watley had just come into the territory in Florida, and he was there about a month, and they decided to push him, and he gave his notice. He was going to go to Bill.
Mm-hmm.
And Eddie came into Dusty, and he said, "I'm going to stop this, because if Bill Watts wants this kid, he's got to have something.
Yeah.
I'm going to call Bill. You keep booking him, Dusty." Dusty said, "Well, he gave his notice." He said, "Hey, they don't notice, don't stick." He went in his office, came out and said, "Okay, it's done. Just keep on booking him." This guy was ready to leave, probably gave his notice at his apartment.
Right. That's what I'm thinking.
You know,
right?
But he wasn't going to leave, and that's what they started to do at the end. They got tighter and tighter. And like I said, there was 37 territories, but then they started to fold because the smaller ones, they were only there for guys on the way up, on the way down, or homesteaded there.
Yeah.
And you know the Shane, if you're in a territory like Portland, which was very small, every town was the same every week. You're there 4 years, you're burnt.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But guys would stay and go down to the bottom of the card, and, you know. So it was very interesting.
Was there a flip side compendium to that? So, like, if Bill Watts, you know, if I was saying I was leaving and Bill Watts, would he be able to call them and say, "Hey, I need him for 2 more weeks, but can you send me Kevin Sullivan?"
Yeah, and I'll give you a perfect example of that was Vince Sr. used to take a lot of guys from Florida and Bill's territory. He had a way to maneuver it. He would call Bill and say, "Hey, Bill, Waldo Von Erich, I need a guy to wrestle Bruno in 2 months. I got to get him ready, so I need him in 2 months from now." Well, Bill ain't going to tell Senior no, because they had a great relationship, and Bill could go up there and work and talk to him. But Senior would say, "Oh, by the way, because you're doing that for me, I'm going to give 6 more weeks for Andre next year." So they worked hand in hand.
Right.
But yeah, they would say, like you just said, they would say, I can't let him go. He's involved in a program. I need him for 6 weeks. "Well, Bill, what can you do?" "Well, I got a young kid here, Billy Bob. Is he any good?" "Well, he's not as good as Douglas, but he's going to be good later on." "Well, can he work?" "Yeah, he can work." "Okay, send him for 6 weeks. I'll send him back to you."
Interesting. Yeah. I always figured there had to be that kind of communication, because I mean, you hear the stories, read the stories of all these older guys, and they were here, then they were here, then just sort of skipped around. But that was also like your point about Portland. You know, if you're there for 4 years, you're pretty much spent. Not much money left in you, but you could leave and go to a couple of those other territories for a year and a half, come back and be red hot.
Yeah, right.
So it's the fans already remember you.
Well, I've mentioned this with Kerry Sullivan one time. Kerry is a big wrestling fan, was the owner of Ring of Honor, as you know. He said one of the biggest pops he would hear when they were in Madison Square Garden, the announcer at the Mission would say, "And coming back after a long absence, Chief Big Hat," and people would pop because he had joined money before, he had went away. It was, you had to be very astute to understand when the time was to go.
Yeah.
Because if you're in a good position, and you know, Shane, you're very smart. You know when you're in that good position, that when they come to you the first time and say, "Well, we need to do this," you're going to say, "Well, that makes sense," and you go ahead and do it. The next time they come to you, you want to know what's going on, and then you do it, and then your two matches flow.
Right. Yeah. And you can read those tea leaves.
Yeah. And those tea leaves should tell you it's time to go. Don't burn out, and have a talk with them on the way out. Say, I'd like to leave in a pretty good position here. A lose-leave town match or something.
Yeah.
So
I would imagine for the rest. Again, I'm just sitting here putting myself into that position and thinking what would I do. Stick a standard with this Bill Watts meeting. So if I was going to leave Bill Watts to go to Portland, I can call my friend Kevin. That's good. Here's the good and bad of the companies or whatever. But it's still an unknown to me. It's a question mark. I know what I'm making here. And so I'm jumping out of that money that I know I'm making to go up there for a question mark. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but the territories didn't say, "Okay, Kevin, we'll bring you in and give you a contract $10,000 a month."
Right.
Or whatever.
Exactly.
It was an unknown.
And that was the scary part. You'd hope that, you weren't jumping in the fire when it was good if a territory was not dead, but floundering a little. And they said, "Hey, listen, we need a little help here on the babyface or heel side, and this is what we got planned for you." Well, you could see that, okay, if they're going to invest that kind of money in you, and they all figured out what kind of money you were making, that you're usually going to make a little bit more than you did before you left. And then if you got the territory to move, you were in a good position. Now it kind of equals out the power. Right. They had all the power. Yeah.
Dominic used to always tell this story. Again, hard to believe he's been gone for a year. When he left, when they did the Shea Stadium show with Andre and Hogan as the heel, he was on that earlier card and got his check, and it was a tenth of what he thought it should be. So he went back to Vince Sr. and said, "Hey, problem." And Vince told him, "So well, my hands are tied or whatever." And Dominic tells this story. He said one of these things where he just reacted, didn't think it through. He folded the check up and put it in Senior's pocket and told him, "You need that more than I need," and left. Well, now he's home and realizing, what do I do, bills and everything. And he called, who was the promoter in Buffalo?
Ed Don George?
Ed Don George, there was it'll pop in my head here in a second, but he called him and it had been going downhill. Just said it was Bobo versus the local guy, and month after month or week after week, it was just going down. So he went up and got to deal with him, and Dominic started working with Ernie on top and popped the place, getting the place to filling up and stuff. He said he made better money there than he had for the previous 5 years working with Vince, the WWF.
Yeah.
Because you could see the building's 100 people, now there's 1,000 people. And so just to supplant your point, obviously Vince going and taking, my perusal on it as a kid before I even got into the business was suddenly here's Hulk Hogan in AWA and WWF. Here's Junkyard Dog from Mid-South, WWF, DiBiase, all these cherry picking of these talents. I've heard other people like Bruno and Dominic and a lot of other old timers talk about this. And first of all, do you specifically recall, they tell it, and the other people I've spoken to talk in terms of everybody thought that he'd end up in a river somewhere. But you thought I was going to do it. I thought you were somebody else who's going to do it. And then, Vince, did you hear stuff like that? Or is that an urban legend? In
No,
that business?
it's an urban legend, but we heard about it. But I think what happened was most of the promoters got complacent.
Yeah, very.
Yeah, and I believe this, and I'll believe it to my dying day. If it wasn't for Jim Barnett, there would have been no Vince McMahon.
Oh, sure.
Because Jim went up there and got him all those TVs because he had all those connections.
Mm-hmm.
So now they rolled the dice. They went up on the TVs who were using the local promotion as a way to get ad revenue and get a few dollars from the wrestling promotion.
Okay.
Now Vince comes in and suppose we'll say he comes from Minneapolis. I heard this told numerous times about San Francisco. Vern put his tape in San Francisco and they were charging him $1,000 a week. Vince came in and said, I'll give you $5,000. How are you going to compete?
Right.
You're only running it once a month.
Mm.
So once Vince bought all the TVs up, he was in control.
Yeah.
Now wrestling's drawing ratings.
Mm-hmm.
Now he goes and says, we need to renegotiate. And they say, well, what do you mean we need to renegotiate? Well, now you have to pay me.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to give Vince credit. He took a chance and rolled the dice because if it didn't go, Jay, that was a heavy, heavy nut to pay.
Yeah.
But I really do believe is that they got complacent and the old time promoters, and when they had those couple of shows in Memphis where it was All Pro or whatever the name was, they brought everybody from the territories up. Watts was there, Eddie was there, Jarrett was there, I think Geigel was there, Crocker was there. The problem was, every one of them wanted to put their guys on top.
Right. Yeah.
They didn't see the big picture, and they didn't think. They were thinking about saving their own asses rather than saving the territories as a whole. So, and then promoters started to die off too, or get real old, and they didn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah. It's a fascinating period of wrestling history to me, in large part because I was still, when I was breaking in, had a toe still in that. Not that I was going to territory, but I was well aware of those different places. And over the first couple of years in the business, watching it go from the 37 to the 15 to the 7, 8, and just dribble on down. What do you attribute it to? Again, I know I'm jumping around here, but the way my brain works, having worked with WCW and NWA and other companies that had competed against Vince, what do you think it is? And I'm sure there's a value. You probably write 10 books about it, but what separated Vince from the Ted Turners and the rest of it? Is it something as simple as that was like their side gig? And Vince's was the main, or because let's face it, he's gone up against some of the heaviest hitters, not just in business but in entertainment in this industry, in this country, and he's stepped on most of them.
Right. I think he had an axe to grind as a kid. He grew up in a very hard environment. Mm. He really didn't get with his father until he was 16,
something like that. Yeah.
So he had probably a love-hate relationship with wrestling. And he said, I'm either going to be the king or I'm going to burn it. Mm. And the other thing is, I don't think we hear enough about, he was in New York, the marketing capital of the world.
Right. Yeah.
So how are they going to compete in Kansas City, Missouri?
True. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. So he had everything lined up for him too. I mean, when his father sold him the territory, gave it to him, whatever, the territory was in good shape. But the guys that you mentioned had been there a long time.
Yeah.
So they were still drawing. But now all of a sudden, the production value got much better.
Right. Yeah.
So now I'm used to seeing a bland opening, a ring announcer at ringside. Now I see sets, I get to see more entertainment, more Hollywood bullshit. And now the magazines were big then, right?
Yes.
So now I've been reading about the junkyard dog, but I'm never going to see him. And all of a sudden he comes out on my TV. Wow, I'm going to go down and see him. I've been reading all about him.
Yes.
He did the smart thing. He took those magazines and knew who was over, and he brought them to a place where Don probably wouldn't have left because he was making big money with Bill, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
But Vince had offered him something huge. So now all of a sudden, Junkyard Dog would have stayed with Bill, probably gone to Florida for a year to, get out, and then back to Bill.
Right.
Now he goes up to New York, and he isn't going to New Orleans every Tuesday night.
Yeah.
Tuesday night he's in Detroit. The next Tuesdays he's in Vancouver.
Everywhere.
Yeah. So
To the guys in the business at that time, again, what Vince was doing was so revolutionary in the wrestling industry. Never been done. Were those guys able to see what he was describing to them, or what he had in his head? How do I explain this to make the question better sense? So wrestler A gets a phone call from Vince in New York City. He's making a ton of money in Kansas City, wherever. Was he able to see what Vince saw? Because again, we come from our own little worlds, in that case, territories. I would seem to think that jumping out of that safety net of that territory you're in, going to this guy that's doing something that nobody's ever seen or heard, because he could have easily fell flat on his face. Were they aware of it?
I think that the thing was, even when I got in, like I said, the business, 37 territories, New York was the Mecca. You heard what these guys were making on top. They were in good positions where they had the populace to pay that way. I think there's been the guys that went with Vince, he sold them so well that fear of not being able to leaving the job that they have, it transcended, because what they thought they were going to make, and in the back of their head, if it didn't work, they'd come back and they'd rest.
Yeah, it's the door's still open, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here thinking, going to do that. First of all, if somebody called you and said, "Okay, Kevin, we're going to take that gimmick off you, and we're going to call you,
Joe Tex."
Whatever, and this is your bread and butter, it's been your bread and butter. And this guy suddenly, I just interviewed Luke Williams a few weeks ago, and what really flipped my brain was at the time that they had gone in, they had been the sheep herders, right? And as you said about the magazines, I was reading about these guys, and I thought they sounded like honestly insane, crazy, right? And you see these, never eclipsed, but the pictures and stuff, how violent and vicious they were and scary. Then they go to WWF and they are licking faces and doing the whole gimmick. And I would have thought that those guys, because they were so good at that, some of the originators of that hardcore stuff, would have felt uncomfortable leaving that behind.
I've often thought that too, because I got a chance to work with Luke and Butch a little. They were violent, and
especially for the time. Period, but especially for that.
And I'm with you. When I first saw it, I said, "Oh, this isn't going to work." But then I started to look at the audience, and it was kids that never heard of the sheep herders.
Yeah.
It was, there were guys like me and you that watched the magazines, and they might have been disappointed, but those kids knew nothing. And the guys the casual wrestling fan who didn't buy the magazines didn't know who the Sheepherders were.
Right. Yeah. Well, his answer to that was no, they loved it because they were starting to get a little bit older.
Yeah.
And the hardcore style really takes its toll on your body.
Yeah.
But they were. He did say that for them, it was what was more arduous, even though they were doing less physicality, was that they were doing it 20 times more. To run around. So, but we had the luxury of getting to see them as the Sheepherders. And then later as the Bushwhackers, and see the decades long span those guys have had.
Yeah, and Luke is still out there. So I mean, the other thing was they, as you mentioned, they physicality in the ring. I don't know how much longer they could have kept that up. Do you?
True. No, it's at that point, were they 40s maybe?
Yeah.
Not old by any stage, especially for this industry. But I would imagine, you and I both know that we did at 20, heard a hell of a lot more at 40.
Yeah.
So, but for me, what was always odd looking into the WWE territory, WWF back then, was clarify the two. I had come in '95 and got lured away from ECW, and really didn't want to leave ECW. I was making a good living, a great living, in fact, still teaching, still home 5 days a week. And, but I went, and I often say it was the worst 6 months of my entire career because it was like what we had spoken about before, this character development side, instead of like building legitimacy onto what I had achieved at that point, it was suddenly this 180 back the other direction and going to be this corny type, almost a clown type character. I'm not very good at comedy. I can't remember jokes to save my life, but that franchise character I knew intimately well.
Right.
And it just seems strange to me. I understand the whole point of he wants to create so he can own it. I'd offered to sign the trademarks over to him for the duration of that and open a negotiation on the rest. It just seemed to me like a weird oddity. And now, looking back from 30 years later, Rob Van Dam went in there and they kept him as Rob Van Dam. There's a handful of guys that go in and do that, but by and large, they get changed over to something else. What is I'm trying to ask you, I guess, to get in Vince's head, but what's your opinion on what's at work there? Like, why does Vince say, okay, you're going to be Kevin Sullivan when you come, but we're going to make you the Jobbledy Joe or something?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
I think it's that he's trying to wipe your slate clean, and he's in some ways going to control you completely because that TV is so powerful. When you go off, maybe the franchise has been buried if you stayed there longer.
Mm-hmm.
You stayed there 3 years.
Yeah.
Now they know you as the dean. How do you comfortably switch back to the franchise?
Right.
And I think that was his whole point. That once
It's impossible. People say it's hard to argue with success. It's impossible to really argue with success, and to see how successful he's been. Chris and I had this conversation, our manager, about you and I go around these conventions, and every day we sign hundreds of autographs, and he seems to think that sooner or later that's going to dry up because if somebody wants Kevin Sullivan's autograph, they're going to have it. And then I pointed out to him, like in where we are now in West Virginia, if there were 10,000 people today that got our signature, well, how many more people live in West Virginia? Assuming there's a wall around it, they can't go anywhere else. So it really is like an unlimited supply. You and I couldn't live long enough to sign every autograph. Thank God to the fans out there. But him coming, the product itself, like like you, we learned our craft inside these rooms, right? And like Dominic used to say, you can come through that entranceway, have the greatest ring, music, and robe, but when you get in the ring, come through those ropes, take that robe off and the music stops, you damn well better know how to wrestle.
right.
WWF and E, whichever one you want to call it, to me, there's no, and it didn't then, look like a company that put much stock into inside the squared circle.
No, he wanted to make it entertaining. He wanted to pull the curtain off the business.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I was lucky enough to be on some cards with Bruno. And I'll tell you a funny story. You know the guys where you look out that door, right?
Yeah.
Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. are standing side by side. I'm 2 feet away from 3
Right,
feet away. And Ivan and Bruno are having a match. And it's, you know, they had it for the time and era, the matches with Bruno.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And Koloff picked up a chair, a wooden chair, folded it, and it was the first time I ever saw a wrestler throw a chair, and I copied that, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
He threw it at Bruno, and Bruno didn't even put his hands up, and it hit him square in the face, broke his nose. Blood's coming down. I heard the old man say to Junior, "They're gladiators."
Yeah.
And I could almost see the hair on Junior's neck go up.
Really?
Yeah, I'm saying, well, when he gets in there, he's going to make sure there's no gladiators.
Yeah.
Because how are you going to replace these gladiators?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And then, you know, the more we expose it, the less violence we got.
Yeah.
And I equate this to MMA, UFC. There was a fight, these pound for pound fighted the other week.
Yeah.
2 middleweights, I think, or welterweight. One was double champion. The champion was beating the snot out of the other guy until there was 40 seconds left, and he kicked him in the face and knocked his head and knocked the champion out.
Yeah.
I'm saying, how many super kicks do we see during the night, Shane, you and I?
Way more than we should.
Yeah.
You know.
One kick, the guy goes down, and to me, my family was in boxing for 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the guy doing the job, the guy going over doesn't even know the guy's doing the job.
Yeah.
It was like back in the day, I found this out from my uncle. They, you know, we used to have the term policeman to protect the champion, right? They, during the Rocky Marciano era, anybody that was going to fight Rocky, the fight before, or 2 fights before, fought Archie Moore. And Archie Moore may put him over, but he beat the dog shit.
Yeah.
So he wasn't going in to fight Rocky in the 100%.
Yeah, took a little chunk out of the marble.
Yeah, so as we got more entertainment and more kid-friendly, because you got to remember, back in the day when I was wrestling at the Gardens, you had to be over 14 to get in.
Is that right?
Yeah, there was no kids.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, so now we're filling the arenas with kids. We don't want to horrify them. We want to see these guys as cartoons and superheroes. I mean, I can understand why the old timers like Bruno and Monsoon and Harley knocked Hogan and said he couldn't work. Well,
Yeah.
we know he could work.
Yeah.
But he didn't have to work like that. He was a superhero.
Yes.
So, and these guys were legitimate. If anybody fooled with them, they weren't going to go far against Bruno, right?
Right.
Here's that Calhoun up. I mean, this guy was a stud. And Holly could knock them out.
Yeah.
You know. So, we lost that idea of protecting the business. We just opened up and said, it's a carnival. You know,
Yeah.
come down, get your yellow finger, get your sunglasses, get your t-shirt.
Mm.
And he became a marketing genius. And that's what it is today.
Right.
It isn't, I don't think they look at if the guy has a good match so much. And they do now that there's a different staff in there. But when he was running it, I'm sure the first thing he looked at was merchandise sales.
Oh, cool. Yeah, sure.
So we became merchandise companies and entertainment companies rather than wrestling company. And I wonder, because wrestling is as hot as it's ever been and hotter, and it's been exposed, and they tell you, you know, you look at your phone, and this guy's going to wrestle this guy, and this is what we think is going to go over, and they grade matches and all this. And I wonder, as UFC has hit a lull, but now it's starting to pick back up. And boxing has really picked up, right?
Yes.
90,000 people in London, every fight. How much longer can this fake wrestling keep the hold on the general public?
Right. Well, when you look at, Vince's strategy, as he told it to me, was I can sell a ticket to you, maybe a buddy or two, or I can sell it to a family of 4, probably bring a couple buddies with them and stuff. So you're going to sell double or more of tickets, T-shirts, whatever. The only, again, can't argue with, it's impossible for me to argue with his success, but I started watching wrestling at about 6, 7 years old. And I pulled away from it a bit, like through my late single digits into early, but 13, I found it again and was hooked ever since. You take like Chris's kids out here, 7 and 5. They might love it today, but will they still be watching it 5 years from now? Like you and I grew up watching forever. Again, some say tomato, some say tomato, right? But there are definite key differences between these two schools of thought.
Yeah, there definitely are. And you said something that jolted me just then. I went through the same growth period that you did, that I was a young fan, and then I lost it for a while.
Right.
And then I came back to it.
How old were you when you came back to it?
15, 16.
Okay, mid-teens, yeah.
And the reason why I think I lost it was when I was a kid, Paul Bowser was the promoter and Barnett came in and ran the last 3 shows for him, and then the guy died, and then Barnett went to Australia. There was no wrestling on TV. So
in Boston.
Yeah. So I didn't get to see wrestling until I was about 15 or 16. It came back on. And then, I started picking up some magazines. I saw Bruno. And then what brought me back to first match, there used to be a fullback for the Boston Patriots called Jim Nance.
Oh,
Yeah, he was the...
hard nose.
Yeah, and he was amateur wrestling champion for Syracuse 2 years. And he was a big deal in Boston, and he was going to be a special referee, and I went to see it because I wanted to see him, but it was with Bruno.
Right.
And once I saw
He was working Bruno?
No, he was a special referee for Bruno.
Gotcha.
And when I saw him, I thought, whoa, this is something special, Bruno. And, I fell in love with it again. But do you think you would have fallen in love with it again if it had changed dramatically, like from the sheepherder, if you had seen the sheepherders, now you've seen the bushwhackers?
No, for me, I was a big comic book mark. I loved reading comic books. I read a lot of other stuff too, but I love comic books. And I remember the first segment when I was about 13 years old. My dad had gotten cable, it just came to the area, had it installed that afternoon. My dad it was a railroader, so it was always gone. On this particular night, Saturday night, he was home. And he used it as a younger man, take me to the Civic Arena to watch wrestling, but I always took it like he was having a miserable time, but he wanted to bring me to see it, right?
Yeah.
And the guy leaving gave him a TV guide, he opened it up, and he said, "Hey, wrestling's on tonight at midnight, you want to watch it?" I had no clue my dad liked professional wrestling. It's one of my fondest memories that it's drilled into my head. My dad laying on the couch and I was sitting on the floor leaning against it. And the very first segment of the WOR show from WWWFM was Superstar Billy Graham and Ernie behind a cage, right? It looked like a comic book come to life to me. These people are real. And I remember just like throw the rod in, they got me. Billy was incredibly believable.
Yep.
His size and gift of gab. And then Ernie, as outlandish as he was, you really thought this guy was this smarmy, crazy man, right? The believability, the not insult my intelligence, the characters, and the larger in life aspect of it is what lured me in. So to answer your question, no, today I think I can still remember that 13-year-old kid well enough to know that I might watch it here or there, but I would not be hooked into it.
And it's funny you said something, and I think a lot of us were comic book fans.
Yeah.
I was a comic book fan.
Yeah.
And like I said, now that I was in the business, when I saw Bruno get hit with that chair, I thought, wow, that takes a lot. And the people went crazy because they, I often wondered if someone knew, or at least suspected, that the way we were getting blood wasn't all kosher.
Right, yes.
But when he got hit with that chair and his hands were down and his nose exploded and that shit went flying. There was a gasp, you know. And I thought, wow, these people have to believe.
Right.
Yeah, because he's convincing me.
Yes. I watched a clip of a couple clips. People will periodically send me stuff of Bruno and Dominic. And somebody sent me a clip of Bruno in the ring against Ivan Koloff when Ivan was a big 300-pound monster. No sound to it, so it must have been lifted from like a Super 8 or something. And he's got Bruno down in the corner on the mat, his head resting on the bottom turnbuckle, goes to the other side, loads the boot up, and he comes running, and he boots Bruno right in the face, and you see a trickle of blood. He goes back and does it again, 2 trickles. Keeps doing this, and I'm watching, I know what they're doing, I can't catch how they're doing it.
Yeah.
So I find, because in the freeze frame being that Super 8 stock footage, it was a little bit blurry, but one of the times, 4th, 5th time, I caught what he was doing. Bruno, today what happens is, it's no prestidigitation to it whatsoever. And, what Bruno was doing was, laying there selling, and each time Ivan's boot would come in, he would put his hand up like he was trying to block it, follow it back, and one quick poke. And I thought, the way that these guys were so, it wasn't just having to beat you up if you tell the inside of the business to the outside world. They had so much pride in their business and in their own way of protecting the kayfabe by Bruno not doing this. Yeah. Right? And the sheer genius. But there was another clip I wanted to point out to you with Bruno. When he first came back from the broken neck. The stories that you hear about this, Bruno never went to the hospital that night. He was terrified that his mother at home, who was older and he adored, would find out. So Dominic put him in a cab, drove to the airport, and he flew home with 3 broken vertebrae in his neck. And the ambulance was waiting there in Pittsburgh for him, but at least his mother could be there. It's just like today, something you break your neck, you're going to the hospital, right? Yeah. But the first match back, of course, Stan Hansen had done that. And the first match back, Bruno comes, it's in Madison Square Garden. Stan goes to the ring first and walking around the cage, selling the cage. Now this is before the pyro entrances and music and all that, right? So he gets in the ring and there's a uncomfortably long pause between Bruno coming out. 6, 7, 8 minutes. During that time, Vince is doing the commentary. He says, Bruno, ever the world champion, is giving Stan Hansen time to think about it. Here he comes. And 25,000 people in Madison Square Garden. It's got to be one of the biggest pops I've ever seen. And most sustained pop. They popped for the entire match. And you see something like that. And we've been in the ring. We know how hard it can be to get that crowd to pop sometimes. Absolutely. And to see that, it always felt to me like a magic act of some kind. How do they hypnotize the audience to do this? If you've not seen it poured up, it's really well worth it. The fans out there, the same thing. To see when guys like us talk about the old school, old school, new school almost become vernacular now, right? It's colloquial speak. But the way those men and women then protected the business, each other, themselves, providing the entertainment to the fans, all the while maintaining that air of believability. that's what, at least when I'm talking about kayfabe, that's what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And the differences we
Yep.
see today.
Yep. And the internet, I don't know if we could have kept it that way because of the internet and because of hiring people that never were involved. I'm not going to say you have to be a wrestler,
Right.
but never involved in the business itself, come from Hollywood. Well, don't tell me they're not going to tell everything they know because they're looking for the next job.
Sure.
Everybody is, so they've got a gig. So we were really a closed shop. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And like you said, these guys really, really respected their jobs. And the guys like Ivan and Bruno, they were a breed apart.
Yeah.
You know, they just were. I mean, I always say this. You and I are in a UFO. We come from Jupiter. We land, we know nothing about professional wrestling. We go to the gardens back in the day, right? Past time travel. We go to the gardens back in the day. When Bruno walks out that door, we know he's the #1 champion.
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, he had a presence that, you know, and we knew that Ivan Koloff was a nemesis. It was like you said, go back to comic books.
Yeah.
The evil heel,
Right.
great baby face.
How much of that today, again, when I'm in a history classroom teaching history, I always beat it over the kids' head that it's impossible for us today in 2022 to look back to, say, 1962 and prescribe to them the mores of today.
Oh, exactly.
You need to look at history through a contemporary lens. It doesn't make any of it right. It doesn't make any of it wrong. It just is. History is. When you look at guys like Bruno and how much they protected the business like that, and not only in the ring, if you saw Bruno at a restaurant, walking down the street, you might not have ever watched wrestling, you know he's somebody. When I talk about this charisma, we hear this word charisma, right? The electrifying aspect of that person. Dusty clearly had that. Yeah. Bruno had it. Hogan's got it, right? Flair's got it. They can walk into the room, you and I sitting here talking, room full of people. Yeah. They walk in and both of us stop and go, yeah. You feel them, right? And I mean, I'm not making that up. You literally physically feel them. When you see the guys that have done that, your Brunos and, I keep going over all these incredible talents, Harley Race and all these guys. You can see where it's difficult for them, if not impossible, for them to look at from where they come from in the business. Exactly. To, like, Bruno was not an ECW fan. And I tried like hell to explain it to him. And he just couldn't quite grasp it, just thought it was vulgar and whatever else. And it was. I mean, those are the ingredients of it. But, I just finally gave up and I said to him in the most respectful tone, right? I love Bruno. I said, come on, Bruno, let's be serious. You had a guy with green tongue eating turnbuckles in your head. And he chuckled at it. Okay, you got me. Because it's always been entertainment. Right. In ECW, my approach to the franchise character, what I was getting in the ring, was Vince had taken it to cartoon land and lost people like us. And if we'd have just brought it back, this is where wrestling was when Vince moved it to cartoon land, if we'd have just brought it back to there, I don't know if we would have been able to capture enough of an audience, because some of those guys are it's going to be the same thing and move on. We had to take it way over there and add those things and to get those fans back. And those guys like Bruno that had an immense knowledge of the business just couldn't quite grasp it.
And you're absolutely right. That's a great analogy. You guys had to go 180 degrees opposite. Mm. So that's why you had to go the violence route. That's why you had to go a little risque. Yeah. That's why you played up to the fans a little bit more.
Yes.
But you had to, because if you came out and did the same shit they had seen, you would have been lost. But
my feeling, again, with ECW as we were doing it, was that not just that we had to change the product on its outward appearance like that, but to my mind, because you remember ECW's transition from tri-state to
Right.
Eastern started in '93. That was the same year the UFC started. If you recall, they were getting banned everywhere.
Right.
Because they thought it was a human cockfight. Ironically, that was our issue. Showtime wouldn't air us, and several wouldn't because they thought we were a human cockfight. They weren't quite sure that how much of that line had we blurred and gone over. I'd always thought that wrestling should have gone more to that direction. Because let's face it, especially back then, most of the men, if not all, and women inside that were making money in this ring, they were all pretty salty people. They could take care of themselves, had great backgrounds in wrestling or fighting or whatever. That wrestling would have been far better off to go in that direction than this sort of meandering back and forth between sports and entertainment.
I think you're right because, as you see now, I think the new regime in WWE is trying to pull back to.
Appears that way.
Yeah, it appears that way, and I hope they do well. Because they're the leader in the industry, or should do well.
Let me draw you. We're going to go way back in a second here, but since we're talking about this, this Vince story is a big story in our industry, right? The guy that's dominated for 4 decades suddenly gone out, allegedly.
Allegedly.
Yeah, with Hunter then coming back in, like I'd heard again, just somebody told me, I don't know if it's true or not, but that he's making the kids call it in the ring again. Have you heard that?
I heard something about that, but I mean that'd be the way to do it. I mean,
right.
I was at a show for a signing and I saw these 2 guys. I was at the signing with Andrew Anderson, and we left New Jersey and because of traffic. We got there 2 hours early.
Yeah.
There was 2 guys. They talked 2 hours before. I did my sign, went back to the dressing room and said hello to some people. They're still talking. And I knew one of them, and I actually asked them, are you going 90 minutes through? They went 9 or 10 minutes. And I thought, whoa, somebody's thought something ain't equating to these people.
Yeah.
But you know what you said? You said something that people today don't even understand this. The political correctness, the madness of the country,
Right.
about the mores you're putting it on people. Okay, you think you could have All in the Family on TV?
No.
Okay.
Everybody cares today.
Let's come. They wanted to redo The Office. They can't. They won't because what they did. The Office was, 10 years or whatever.
Right.
Can't do that. Shane, I was on the first card in Atlanta where a black man wrestled a white man.
No kidding.
Think about that.
Yeah. Wow.
Think about
What
that.
was that, 30, 31, 32?
Yeah, it was 38. I mean,
That's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, and I remember going to Dothan, Alabama, first time. And there were 2 sets of water fountains, and lightly washed over,
Yeah.
colored only.
Yeah. Nuts.
I mean, leaps were taken, so
Yeah.
how can you possibly think, everybody's mentality was completely different.
Yeah.
And I mean, so what I'm trying to, I think, is connect the dots is how can we go where we presented this as somewhat of a sport to out and out, everybody knows everything, which is, I understand what they're doing,
Right.
but how much longer are people, is the next generation gonna watch this?
That's the $64 million question, right?
Yeah. Are they gonna go to UFC?
Yeah. Well, my kids, great example, right? They, from the time they've been old enough to walk, would come to shows with me in and out of the dressing room. And they thought they were little hot shits, right? Because they get a hot dog or whatever. But they loved it. They loved wrestling. They were always playing with the action figures, them and all their friends in the neighborhood, the video games, watching the shows, you name it. I noticed one day it just popped into my head that, boy, they haven't touched that tub of, or the video games, like they're a big tub of, mounted up action figures. But not that they just weren't playing with it as much, they weren't playing with it at all. And it coincided when they both started amateur wrestling themselves. And I don't know if the light bulb went on. Both, by the way, are huge UFC fans now. They will occasionally turn on wrestling, but they pretty much have the take on it that you and I have, spoken a different way. They've tuned out. To me, and again, we're good on his name, this is where we are right now. The kayfabe has completely been lost, right? And I always liken, there's two stories that, in my career that really lend both sides of this argument. So the first time I wrestled Dick Murdoch, he was in Biloxi, Mississippi. He'd never been in the ring with him. And, we start the match off the old arm drag, hip toss, body slam thing, right? We're 7-8 minutes in. We lock up, and here's exactly how Dickie called it to me. He said, "Shane, are you listening to me, boy?" I said, "Yes." And he's pushing me to the turnbuckle. He said, "I want you to duck my punch and hit me one time." There was that pause. At that time, I didn't understand it. Snot-nosed kid. But I'm sure in his head, he thought, this kid's green. If I tell him he's going to hit me 96 times, right? But conceivable that, I could punch you right now. You might still look like this. If I punch you 25 times for real,
Right.
your face is a hamburger. Just how, again, they carefully watched, paid attention to that kind of thing and made that stuff important that we see today. The kids go out and they just, again, for the kids out there, understand, I'm not trying to belittle anybody or deride anything. As a fan of wrestling and a wrestler for 40 years, I've watched their athleticism and I am like spellbound by it. It's incredible. But none of it is meant towards where you and I would take it. Where's that heat going to turn on? Where's that comeback coming? The pop of the crowd, the boo of the crowd. None of that seems to be prescient or relevant anymore in wrestling. And that is really, it doesn't matter if it's sports entertainment today or they know it. We're going out in front of a live audience. Our job, I think, is to entertain that crowd, right?
Yeah.
And do you see any of that anymore?
No, I'm going to interrupt you about that. The show we're at yesterday, like you said, the young guys probably look at us as grumpy old men.
Yeah.
But I had to say something to a kid, because I just wanted to give him a hint. In the match, every time he was in a tag match, every time he got tagged in, he'd throw the guy in the corner and charge, guy would move. He did it 4 times in a row. So I went back and I said, you can piss on Superman's cape once, but if you piss on it 4 times, it has to go often. Where they don't have the concept of it, where I got the concept, and where it hit me for the first time about different working and keeping it real and everything you're saying about Murdoch one time.
Right.
I was in Japan and Barrett was over there in Japan and Flair was there too. And Flair wrestled Jumbo Tsuruta for an hour. They were having a hell of a match, I thought. 3 minutes left to go. Jumbo goes to drop an elbow. Rick moves. Jumbo gets a turnbuckle, goes to dive. Rick catches him, turns into a move for Rick. He missed about 5 spots right before they went home. So I thought they had a hell of a match. I said, "Jim, it was a great match, huh?" He said, "Babyface that doesn't win a world title misses 5 times? No."
Yeah.
I said, "Whoa, I didn't see
Different
that."
level of psychology, right?
Yeah.
It's, and that being lost in the business, again, we've seen tectonic shifts in the industry and in the world, of course. But first of all, have you ever seen the formula of our business done properly and it not work?
No, it always works.
Always works, right? You have a heel that can maintain the heat, the babyface knows how to shine. The storyline is articulate and intelligent. It works. I was at a show with Chris some years ago. Again, the names are irrelevant. You can apply this to pretty much anybody today. The kids are in a 10-man tag at the start of the show, and one of them came and asked if I would watch, and when I have the time to do it, I love doing that because it was done for me. And The first 5 walk to the ring, and completely ignoring the crowd. And the crowd's trying to engage. So, okay, that's weird. The next 5 come out and do the same thing. The bell sounds, and we have bees in a jar.
Yeah.
Bodies start flying. It gets down to the last 2. It's everything get kicked to the head. And that guy drops like he's just been shot, but for only a second or half or 2 because he's now out of the ring, jumping around on the floor. And next 2 come into the same spot, same spot, same spot. I'm clueless at this point as to what they're trying to achieve story-wise. 7, 8 minutes into the match, 6, 7 minutes, I start realizing I've seen so many kicks to the head. I'm going to start counting. I had no idea how long they were going, who was going over. And honestly, I probably missed 25 or 30, maybe more kicks at that point. But from that 6, 7 minute mark, they ended up going 26 minutes. So for another 20 minutes, they wrestled. And in that 20 minutes, not including the 25 or 30 I didn't count, 136 kicks to the head. And 12 minutes in, the music starts blasting, and I assume somebody's running in, so I pop my head to the curtain to look at the entrance, nobody. So I pull my head backstage, and I look, there's nobody on deck. So as I start scanning the building, assuming it's probably a Sandman-type entrance, my eyes cross the ring, and I stop and just instinctively yell out, "What the fuck?" Because these guys have been beating the snot out of each other for 10, 11, 12 minutes at that point. They've stopped that, and now all 10 of them are in the ring, and they're dancing together like you would dance with your wife.
Oh, God.
And as soon as they stop, they get back into the kick on the head, right?
Yeah.
So afterwards, I had to, the kid that asked me to watch and came up and I told him, I said, well, I don't sugarcoat stuff, so you want me to tell you? He said, yeah. He said, I learned from criticism. I said, good, because there's a lot of it. And I stopped there and I said, if I ask you, before I get into that, to go have a beer with me after the show, would you? He said, yeah, I'd love to have a beer with the franchise. I said, okay, we walk into that bar, you know how hot Florida can be. I said, bartender puts those 2 bottles down, ice dripping down inside, steam coming out the tub. You pick that bottle up and you're taking that first ice cold drink, and he's going like this. I said, I'm curious, what would you do if I smashed you upside the head with my beer bottle? And he started laughing. I said, no, I'm serious. What would you do? He said, I would kick your ass or I would try. I said, that's the right answer. That's what. If Andre hit me, I'm going to start, he's going to kill me, but I'm going to start swinging. And I said, I'm curious. And he started kicking my ass because I hit you upside the head with my beer bottle. And somebody over in the corner dropped a quarter in the jukebox and just stopped and danced with me. And you could see like the light bulb coming on. And I said, brother, if I got to explain this to you, you're in the wrong industry. We play cowboys and Indians. That's what we do. But they've so tried to recreate the wheel that they've gotten away from all the basic tenets of our business. And now they're just out there winging it. And the clue is, like I tell them all the time, did you hear the audience? They'll go, no. I said, because they weren't making any noise. All those things, and I know I'm rambling on here on my soapbox, MJF, who I think is a phenomenal heel. He's playing old school heel. And again, I can project myself back into that dressing room, the kid that didn't know how to lace his boots. I remember him very well. If I saw somebody like that, half my size, doing really nothing crazy physically, but he's getting all that heat, I would instinctively ask, what's he doing that I'm not?
Yep.
And it's pretty clear, it's pretty easy to discern what he's doing differently, and yet nobody following suit. Does that?
That amazes me. I say to them, why are you watching guys that never drew money, that never going to draw money, than the guys that are drawing money? Can't you see the separation? And they just don't get it. And
Right.
again, I think it sounds like we're bitching at them. We're not. But the problem was, okay, you go to watch territory. You have a match with Dickie Murdoch. You get in the car and you're riding with Jake. He's going to tell you for 3 hours what you did, what you didn't do, and how to correct it.
Yes.
Well, if you don't correct it,
Yeah.
he ain't going to talk to you.
Right.
These kids don't have anybody to sit under a learning tree and learn. So they just reinforce themselves that what they're doing is great.
Yeah.
And don't understand that, to me, less is more. I mean, didn't Brock and Roman wrestle 3 times? Some pay-per-views just recently.
Yeah, I believe it's in that neighborhood, yes.
The matches start, it's wrestling. Brock beats the dog shit out. And now Brock's a babyface. I'm thinking, all these kids are watching all this stuff, yet here's the guys that are on top of WrestleMania, and they're not doing anything remotely similar to what these two guys are doing.
Right.
The dancing one, come on.
And the connection not made.
Yeah.
Again, no reason to say any names and get anybody in the heat, but I asked a good friend at AEW, how is it that I don't see any Arn in any of these kids, any Tully, any Jerry, any Taz or whoever? You see none of that. And I know how, I either work with most of those or learn from them. And I know how this person's looking at me and said, Shane, they just won't listen. And I started laughing. I said, I don't remember that being an option when I was a kid. But, if you're a professional football player, you get drafted up, there's Tom Brady standing right over there. You're a quarterback. You have any questions for him?
Yeah.
Because I would seem to hope that you would,
Yeah.
if you plan on having the greatest of all time, right?
Yeah.
Arn Anderson, one of the greatest of all time.
Yes.
Jake, same, all these guys. So it's because again, so the kids out there understand. Like you joked about it, saying that it sound like we sound like grumpy old men. It really isn't that. It's I've known you forever. Same as myself. I love professional wrestling.
Yeah, we want to save our business.
Yeah, save the business, and I want to be able to sit down in my living room and flip on the TV and watch a great wrestling match. I love wrestling.
Yeah.
But let's go way back. So way back to the beginning. You get smitten by the bug.
Right.
Okay. Well, a lot of fans get smitten. What was your avenue in? Like, who did you know anybody?
It was the strangest story. It's almost hard to believe. It's almost like this was ordained.
Yeah.
I was wrestling amateur, and I was wrestling for the Cambridge Y, the Waltham Boys Club, and the YMC Union. It's the second oldest athletic club in the country. The New York Athletic Club is the oldest. And I was wrestling amateur, and I go down at the athletic club, and I run a bunch of guys who amateur wrestlers who hook up and would all wrestle. One day, this guy comes in, about 180 pounds, handsome guy. He says, "You want to work out?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So me and him were wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, "I'm going to get something to eat." He knew I was a kid, and he said, "I'll buy you some lunch. Thanks for the workout." So we start talking. Graduated from Oxford and Harvard Business School.
Wow.
He came from South Africa. He was the Berry family, the diamond people.
Yeah.
Wanted to be a pro wrestler, but was beneath his stature in life. Knew Bull Heffern, the promoter there.
Yeah.
Bull wanted to get him in the business. He said, my parents would kill me. He was an Arrow shirt model. He was in One Day for Your Life, or one of those soap operas, Day for Your Lives, or whatever.
Days of Our Lives,
Yeah.
yes.
He played in that for a couple of years. I mean, a real bone for bone man. So we work out for about a month. He says to me, just wrestling, amateur. And he says, "You ever think about being a pro wrestler?" I said, I got back into it, but I wouldn't even know how to go.
Right.
He said, "Well, I wrestle on a show in Montreal on Sundays." I said, "It's only 200 miles from Boston."
Yeah.
I said, "What do you mean you wrestle?" I said, "I thought your family didn't want you to be a wrestler." He said, "No, it's not for a career." He said, "It's what they call these local shows." I said, "I don't know." But anyway, in Montreal, at the time, there was two companies, the Rougeaus and the Chants.
Right.
But on Sundays, there was in Verdun, there was a guy there that trained them all. His name was Pat Curry in Europe. He was the #1 star ever in Europe. And his real name was Pat Girardi. He trained Patterson, the guy, Terry Garvin, Ronnie Garvin.
Ronnie just spoke about this guy.
Yeah.
I knew him a few weeks ago.
Fernand Frechette, everybody.
Yeah.
So they bring me up. I don't know what I'm doing, right? So I said, the guy's name that brought me out was Peter. I said, "Peter, what are they gonna do? Somebody gonna walk me through this thing?" He said, "I guess so. I don't know." So I was sitting in the dressing room. Now it's bell time. First match is on. I'm on third. I said, "Peter, someone going to tell me something?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Referee." He said, "Oh, I'll be back with a minute." He goes, second match, I'll be back with you in a minute. Now the bell's ringing.
And you're sitting a brick.
Yeah, so I walk out, don't know what I'm doing. Get in the ring, and now this guy Fernando Frechette was a big draw for the Rougeau office, but over there he wore a mask. So me and him were gonna wrestle. So the first thing is, bell rings, I go into the middle of the ring, he comes, we go to tie up, I knew how to tie up a little. I fly mirror, half-ass fly mirror.
Yeah.
He lands on his ass, I kick him in the head, hard. He scoots out on the apron to fucking say, what the fuck are you doing? And he's holding on to the ropes.
Yeah.
You know the old slingshot deal?
Yeah.
You did so well.
Yeah.
I said, my mind said, well, I've seen that move, what do I do? Rather than go into the ropes and slingshot, man, I hit these ropes and I come off at about 30 miles an hour and out in the third row. In the chairs, he gets up, takes the mask off, and he's swearing in French. Tabarnak! Takes the mask off, goes back to the dressing room. I, in my infinite wisdom, jump up on the second rope and I'm yelling, come back, please come back. So now I'm saying, the referee scoots out of the ring. So I'm saying, oh, Jesus, what's going to happen here? I'm going to get my ass kicked or we're going to fight. I go in there and he's waiting for me. And he says, what the fuck? I said, I'm sorry, sir. Nobody told me anything. He said, how long have you been wrestling? I said, I've never wrestled a day in my life. The referee walked by and grabbed that referee by the throat and pinned him against the wall and said, you stupid bastard, he could have killed me or I could have killed him. So he turned to me and I'm thinking, oh God. And he said, you're here next Sunday. He said, come up 3 hours early and you and I are going to train.
Wow.
That's how I got in. Then I got sent to, and I also went to New York, 234 Broadway gym in Brooklyn. I was the only angle in the gym. It was Victor Rivera, Johnny Rods, Pedro, Ramon Perez, Isaac Rosario, and after that, at the time, things come full circle.
Yeah.
West Virginia was a territory.
Right.
And I came down to West Virginia.